Hey guys, welcome to the channel. As you see in the thumbnail, what if Luffy ate ghost fruit and master it? Before I start, please do support for more awesome content, and subscribe my channel and like this video. Go support and follow the Tuna for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story. Link in the description. Let's start this video. Rhea! Rhea! A young girl of 7 looks up from the small panpipes she blew through softly. Rhea, darling, I need some more warai. Can you go get some for me? Asks her mother. Yes, mommy, Rhea replies sweetly. She skips over to the table and reaches for a straw basket. Her mother calls her back before she could reach the door. Rhea turns and walks back. Do you remember what I told you a long time ago? Her mother asks. Rhea nods. She says in a small voice, don't go near the mountain. And don't eat too much of the warai. Her mother nods. She strokes Rhea's jet black hair. It had grown to the middle of her back. Yes, darling. If you eat too much warai, you won't remember what you were supposed to do. Rhea pouts. But when can I eat as much as I want? She asks. It makes me laugh so much. And a little tickly in my tummy, she adds with a giggle. Her mother pretends to ponder. I guess when you can look after yourself. But mommy, I see myself in the mirror all the time. Her mother smiles. I meant when you don't need me anymore, she told Rhea. Rhea thought about this. Well, then I will look after myself starting today, she says proudly. Her mother pats her head and smiles again. Okay, but I still need some of that warai, she reminds Rhea. Rhea jumps up. Oh yeah. Bye, mommy. I'll be back in half an hour, she shouts to her mother. She races out of the square orange house and runs up the hill into the forest. She follows a well-beaten path. Her pale blue skirt bounces up and down. About 10 minutes later, the warai orchards come into view. The trees looked very normal, and were planted in rows, but the fruit was just bizarre. Rhea hums sweetly as she plucks the twisty iridescent fruit and places it in her basket. It feels smooth in her hand. Oh, when I cry. I eat warai. From Chin-shima. The sea hates those who eat the cursed fruit of Chin-shima's womb. So be wary the doomed. Then we all eat warai and laugh till we die. She collects 10 before she stops. How much did mommy want? She asks herself. She picks another warai and tosses it into the air. Swinging her basket to and fro, she starts to walk back and hums some more. Suddenly she trips, and the fruit rolls everywhere. Oh! She yelps. She rushes after the fruit rolling down the hill back to the orchard. After a minute of helter-skeltering, she returns back to her basket. 6, 7, 8, 9. She counts. Her hands move through the fruit basket, but the 10th one is missing. She looks around worriedly, and a glint of rainbow colors suddenly catches her eyes to her left, near a large rock hill. The hill stretches past the clouds. What a big hill! She says in awe. She skips off the path to the bottom of the hill and retrieves the fallen fruit. She deposits it in her pockets. A faint rustling is heard by the bushes as the wind blows. Rhea hears a faint ing. The wind stops blowing, and the ing stops. Rhea stares at the bushes. She advances with little steps. Hello? She asks hesitantly. She walks closer to the bushes and pulls them apart. She gasps. A large tunnel 4 feet high and wide is carved into the rock. The fruit basket now forgotten, she steps in cautiously. Curiously, it wasn't cold. She walks forward, her steps growing more confident. Her hair floats along. Then, without warning, the tunnel stops and she enters a large cavern that could fit a marine battleship. She gapes and suddenly feels very small. But that wasn't all. Strange trees grew from the ground. There wasn't any sunlight, and the fruit was more peculiar than warai. They were all oddly shaped, and had curly stems. Akuma no Mi, mutters Rhea. The devil fruit. The whole cavern floor was littered with the trees, laden with the cursed fruit. Rhea walks forward a bit, and then rushes to the nearby tree. She runs around with joy at the beautiful colors. Suddenly, she spots an odd fruit on a low branch. It shimmers, and then disappears. Then it materializes back, and detaches itself from the branch. Gravity seems to have no control on this fruit. It hovers around and floats lazily away. Rhea stops jumping and stares at the floating fruit. It disappears again, and Rhea runs after it. She spots it again to her left and grabs it. It feels unnaturally smooth. She laughs with joy. She hears voices to her right. They come closer. Pocketing the fruit, she runs with all her might to the tunnel and doesn't stop until she reaches daylight. Phew, she says with relief. She picks up her basket of warai and walks back home. She opens the front door. Mommy, here's the warai. Can I eat just one? Please? I took care of myself today, begs Rhea. Her mother turns halfway around from over by the sink. All right. Just this once. Now why don't you go outside for a bit of fresh air? It's so sunny and the sky is so blue. Look at the grass, suggests her mother. Rhea puts the basket on the table and runs outside. She giggles as she runs in circles by herself. I can take care of myself, she says gleefully. She falls down and rolls onto her back, then looks up into the sky. The wind ruffles her hair and moves her blouse around. She sighs with contentment. Her hand reaches into her pockets and takes out a smooth fruit. She bites into it and swallows joyfully, waiting for the aftermath tickling. It didn't come. Instead, she feels lightweight and more carefree than ever. This wasn't warai fruit. She gasps with shock. She looks down at the fruit she bit out of frantically. There wasn't anything in her hand. What? She exclaims. She then gurgles with shock. Her voice is soft and ethereal. The ground starts to fall away. Or was it her starting to float away? No, down, no, Rhea whimpers. She can see her hand, which was good. She runs inside. Mommy! I ate a devil fruit. Why I am scared, Rhea cries. Her mother jerks and breaks a plate. She turns around. Rhea! Where are you? Her mother screams. Mommy, I'm right here. Rhea tugs on her mother's dress. Her mother waves her arms wildly. I can't see you. Rhea! There is a short silence. Rhea remembers the fruit's behavior. She says a small voice. I know you can't. Chapter 1. 10 years later. They called it the ghost fruit. Rhea didn't know, but she knew its powers. Like the fruit itself, she could turn transparent, eat, will, or teleport. She could also float. Those two abilities went together. Her voice would change into the ethereal voice she would gain a translucent/transparent, it fluctuated image. She controlled the transformation, but in anger or fear she lost control. How did this change her life? It forced her into early maturity. She was called a freak by her peers. This didn't bother her as much because the fruit gave her the ability to execute revenge, without getting caught, of course. An unfortunate side effect to all of this was a different kind of loneliness than the one where everyone ignored you because you were a freak. This time, the people of Chinchima couldn't help ignoring her. That meant free warai fruit from the market. The whole island was covered in trees. Mostly warai trees. Rhea glided down the street to the market. She could feel her wispy hair float behind her. It was like she was in water. People passed without looking at her. They couldn't see her. Finally, the market came into view. It was busy and full of people haggling for fruit, or vegetables, or meat. She stopped at a warai stall and held the fruit to her face, inspecting the iridescent colors. One tinkled temptingly, and she grabbed it and floated to the merchant. With a faint whiff sound, she materialized in front of him. Being about 172 centimeters tall, plus the hip-length fine hair framing her pale face, she didn't need the devil fruit to look like a ghost. The merchant jumped backwards involuntarily, and then swallowed uncomfortably. I'd like this, please, she told him sweetly. He calmed down a bit and managed to say, 10 berries. Rhea shrugged her smooth shoulders and gave it to him. Pocketing her fruit in her pale green loose pants, she adjusted her white blouse. Her panpipes whistled as the wind blew. The blouse was supposed to be below her shoulders, but it always slipped. Now on solid ground, she stepped onto the path leading up the mountain. As she left the square, she overheard some citizens talking amongst themselves. Words spreading about the warai fruit, said one. The other glanced around. The trade is flourishing. Let's hope it lasts the whole season. The warai should last us enough. And the other fruit? Rhea walked away quickly. The other fruit? She hadn't told anyone of her discovery 10 years ago. She dismissed the thought and continued climbing. When she left the last of city civilization and entered the mountainous area, she stopped. Turning around, she ran down the steep path and jumped, hands outreached into the air. A faint pop was heard and the wind carried her up. Staying in the spread eagle position, she floated away from the earth and climbed higher. She aimed for a cliff facing the only Chinchima port and stepped lightly down onto the springy grass. No one could reach this place, she was sure. Maybe the mountain goats could, but they didn't bother her. She sat down on the edge of the cliff and took out her warai. She remembered that fateful day when she bit into another fruit that was completely different. She was the only one of her kind on this island, she knew that. But when would she find others? It didn't feel right on this island. And what did she want? She was pretty lonely, she figured. But how could she put her powers to use? She wanted to know. She wanted to help. Ugh, maybe some people will come along to boring Chinchima and take me along. I just want to experience the world, she told to the wind. It eddied in response and ruffled her hair with encouragement. She sat down on the grass and pulled out her warai. Biting into it, she waited for the aftermath tickling. It didn't come. It never did again since that day. She started to hover, but didn't notice. A tear dropped into the grass, and next came the warai. Rhea pulled out her panpipes and began to blow, her notes unearthly. A few stray tears dropped onto the ground. The ing sound carried around the mountain. 220 berries, offered Nami. The paper bird squawked in protest. Nami raised her hand up in finality. Her orange hair fluttered in the wind. 230. You raise it and this is the last paper I'll get, she snapped. The bird seemed to ponder. Nami started to fidget. We've been through this since before the magic mountain. The bird honked in agreement and held out a wing for her payment. She gave the berries to it, and it handed her the paper and flew off the ship. Nami held the paper under her arm and walked back to her chair by the bow. She sat down and opened the paper. When she reached to get her drink from the table, she noticed it was empty. Sanji, she called. Yes, Nami-san, shouted Sanji as he burst out of the doors from the kitchen. Sanji, my glass is empty, she remarked. Sanji ran down the stairs and to her sunning chair by the bow. He grabbed the glass and sprinted back up. Right away, my dear, he shouted happily before he disappeared inside. Nami giggled. He's so silly, remarked Usopp quietly in the middle of his work. He was sitting cross-legged on the deck by Nami's left. He fiddled with some ammo and scratched underneath his tan bandana. I know, replied Nami with an amused smile. Sanji burst out of the doors again and placed Nami's refilled refreshment on the table. Only for you, my love, he exclaimed. Suddenly, a straw hat poked over Sanji's shoulder, followed by Luffy's head. Where are we going, Nami? Luffy asked. Nami kept on reading. Hey, get off me, Sanji muttered. Luffy's head turned a full 180 degrees before he spotted Usopp. Usopp was delicately placing a bullet into a jar of green powder. Luffy ran over and peered at the procedure. Wow, what's that? Luffy asked in wonder. Usopp kept on working. It looks like snow. Luffy extended a finger and dipped it in the green powder that has fallen to the deck. It hissed quietly, and Usopp started to talk. It's a new thing I invented, he explained. Luffy examines the powder on his finger. Usopp continued. The enemy dismisses the powder and continues fighting. Suddenly, he feels all tingly, and then a burning sensation. Then he disintegrates, he said proudly. Then he scratched his head. I'm still trying to make a bullet that won't disintegrate, like the jar isn't right now. Luffy twitched his green finger. My finger's starting to tingle, he observed. Usopp turned quickly to look at Luffy's finger. Oh my god, Luffy! Get it off your finger while you still have a chance, he yelled. Luffy panicked and ran to the nearest doorway. He trampled Zoro before he entered the door. What the dash? Yelped Zoro. He looked at the closed door. He then sat up and held his head in his hands. Luffy walked out of the room. Usopp, I cleaned it off, he said grandly. Usopp raced to his side. How? He questioned. Zoro stood up. Luffy grinned. I washed it off in there, Luffy said and pointed to the door he exited. Usopp had a puzzled expression on his face. But that's our water supply dash. Usopp fell to the floor of the deck in shock. Zoro's mouth drops. Dash 1 minute later. What? Nami stood up violently. Her glass of juice was knocked over. And now he's poisoned our water supply, concluded Usopp. Chopper was busy bandaging Luffy's finger. Nami walked over to Luffy and grabbed his shoulders. You're smarter than this. I know it. What did you eat this time? She interrogated Luffy. He thought for a bit. The twisty, rainbow-colored fruit. It made me laugh, he told her. Nami released Luffy and walked back to her chair and pulled out a map. Sanji suddenly stood up. His blonde hair waved in the wind. Luffy, he said menacingly. You ate my warai fruit? Luffy shrugged. All I can say is that it was very good. Zoro sighed. He looked over at Nami. So where are we going to get new water? He asked. She pointed to their location on the map. This is where we are now. The locator is done setting in our next course. About 15 minutes from here is the island called Shinshima, she told the crew. They all gathered around the map. Coincidentally, that's the island where the warai fruit comes from. It's also the only place it survives on. I heard of a legend about that place. She glanced at the crew members. Zoro shrugged. I'm all for it if you are, Nami-san, cried Sanji. Chopper piped up, I need more water to wash my equipment. Sanji added. We won't be able to cook meat for our dinner without water. Luffy stood up abruptly. What? Well, what are we waiting for? Let's go. He jumped to the mast and helped Sanji bring the sails down. The Straw Hat Jolly Roger unfurled, and Zoro grinned. He proceeded to bring up the anchor, and his green hair blew back from his face. Wes, murmured Usopp. He turned the rudder. The sails caught the wind and poofed. Nami laughed with joy, and Luffy sprang back to the bow. Shinshima, here we come. Rhea sighed sadly and transformed back. She heard the familiar whiff. It seemed to her that every time she turned back, it went whiff, and when she used the powers it went pop. She stooped to pick up her warai fruit, and when she straightened, she spotted something on the horizon. It was a pirate ship, speeding towards Shinshima. She gasped with horror, but noticed the odd Jolly Roger. It was meant to install fear. A straw hat installed fear? She stifled a giggle and jumped off the cliff. Pop she went, and she spread her arms and willed herself to float down to the port. I'll be waiting for them, she thought to herself. Rhea landed softly onto the cobblestone. The waves sprayed her, and she felt a bit weaker. Whiff. She was back to normal. Now what to do while I wait? She thought to herself. She spotted an inconspicuous place by the only dock available for a pirate ship that size. She stepped lightly over there and leaned back. Her pants swished about her ankles. Slowly, she slid down until she was sitting. Then she took out her bitten warai and ate it, to look like the other people. She started to nod. Slowly, she entered the darkness of sleep. Time sped up while she was unconscious. About 1 second passed for her before the thud of the docking ship woke her. A rope ladder was thrown out from above. Pop. They couldn't see her now. The first person out was wearing the straw hat featured on their sail. He wore a red shirt and denim cutoffs, with fur lining the bottom hem. Next down the ladder was a girl with orange hair. She had a skirt on, and observed her surroundings and nodded with affirmation. They both looked normal enough. The other two pirates hopped down. They were arguing with each other. One was a tall blonde, and the other had a tan bandana on. He had a long nose. Finally, two more figures jumped down. One had green hair and triple ear piercings. Odd green hair? But the other figure beat odd fair and square. A hulking thing ambled down wearing a pink top hat. It had a blue nose. Rhea squeaked. Well, she thought she squeaked. It came out as a whispery trill. Rhea clamped her mouth shut. Yes, we're here, shouted the guy with the straw hat. The others stretched, and the girl adjusted her locator on her wrist. She murmured something to the guy with the bandana. Meanwhile, they proceeded down the street. Rhea had to see what they were going to do. To test her cover, she floated right between them. Suddenly, the orange-haired girl pointed to their right. To the market. I need to get a map of this place or talk to some water merchant, she started to say. They turned and walked down the road. It was full of stalls and people buying stuff. Rhea weaved in and out between the pirates. She decided to check them out. First, she floated by the straw hat dude. She looked at his face, which was busy turning left and right. Next, she went to the tall guy. She had to stifle her bubbling laughter, because he was busy gawking at all the girls. She somersaulted in the air and landed in front of the bandana guy. They were all looking for something. Suddenly they stopped. The straw hat guy pointed to a water stall. "Aha! Let's ask that guy, Nami!" he burst out. Nami nodded, and the whole troop marched over there. Rhea followed silently. "Where is the nearest water source?" Nami asked the merchant. While they talked, she resumed her inspection. The blonde told the straw hat, "I'm gonna get some more warai, Luffy." Luffy shrugged and turned back to the conversation. "Sanji, I'm coming. I need to check what the stores have," said the bandana guy. Sanji nodded. "Zoro, tell Nami that Usopp and I will meet you guys back at the ship in half an hour," said Sanji. The green-haired man nodded. The blue-nosed animal looked up. "I'll stay here," it said. Rhea crept closer to Zoro. She leaned in and peered at the piece of cloth tied on his arm. She looked up at his earrings, and then tugged one of them. He quickly turned to his left and glanced at the animal. It was busy checking the water for its purities. He shrugged and fingered his earrings. She tried to be more careful and inspected the animal's hat. Its blue nose started to twitch. It sniffed some more, and Rhea backed away slowly. Zoro turned to face the animal. "Someone's here," it said quietly. Zoro turned around and looked behind his shoulder. "I don't see anyone, Chopper," he observed. Chopper sniffed some more. "I can smell her," he said. Zoro raised an eyebrow. "Her?" he asked. Chopper nodded. "The scent is pleasant. Guys don't smell that good," he explained. Zoro grinned, but his hands rested at his swords. "Nami, we have company," he murmured. Luffy stopped listening and turned to look at Zoro. Nami also turned. "Where?" "I don't see him," asked Luffy. Zoro shook his head. Chopper smelled her. Rhea had heard enough. She ran into the crowd and didn't stop until she made it to their ship. They wouldn't think she'd be back here, would they? And what did she smell like, anyways? She sniffed her white blouse, but couldn't smell anything. She walked over to her old spot and sat down on the stone ground. Whiff. She crossed her arms and legs. She could wait again. Chopper stopped sniffing the air. "She's gone," he said. Nami looked thoughtful. "No one had any money on them, right?" she asked. The others nodded. "Whoever that was had the perfect chance to harm us," she said softly. Zoro coughed. "Actually, I remember someone pulling on my earring," he told her. Nami furrowed her arched eyebrows and thought. "We should look for her when we have a chance," she said. A short, thoughtful silence followed. "I know. We'll have to split up for this. But we better hurry before Chopper loses the scent," she said quickly. Chopper shook his head. "It's almost everywhere," he said quietly. "Some are more recent trails. I never noticed it until a minute ago. It's a very familiar one to me." Nami thought some more. "Chopper, go and find Usopp and Sanji. Bring them back to the ship. We need to plan a few things first," she directed Chopper. He nodded and transformed into a reindeer, then sprinted away down the road. Luffy turned around in circles. "But where's the warai? I thought you were talking to the warai merchant," he exclaimed. Zoro sighed. "I don't think you need any more, Luffy," said Nami. She closed her eyes briefly and then the party walked to the port. Rhea heard them well before she saw them. They weren't like the normal pirates at all. They came into view and Luffy was laughing while pointing at a scowling Zoro. "Hey, she could have pulled off your straw hat too, you know," he retorted. Luffy abruptly quieted and took up a more serious mood. They re-entered the port and made their way to the docks. Rhea rose and dusted off her pale green loose pants. Her hip-length, fine black hair whipped about. Wisps of it trailed behind her as she walked towards the party. She meant to see if Chopper was with them, but it was only Luffy, Zoro, and Nami. Suddenly she had walked in front of the party. Before she knew it, her foot gave way and the ground grew closer at a remarkable speed. Her quick reflexes kicked in and she curled up in a ball. She rolled and stood up. Her hair swirled around her. Slowly brushing her pants off with her long, slender fingers, she turned and looked at the pirates. They all had different expressions on their faces. Luffy grinned, Nami smiled in relief, and Zoro had a quizzical expression on his face. She gazed into each of their eyes for a second. Then she gave a quick wink with a smile and walked back into the crowd. Her hair trailed in the air behind her. So, no Chopper. She could do that. As she walked away, she noticed a lightweight feeling on her. She grabbed at her neck. She gasped. Where were her panpipes? Nami and Luffy climbed up the rope ladder. Zoro looked back and scanned the crowd. Who was that girl, anyways? He wondered. Her eyes seemed so empty. They were blue, but blue as in cold ice. He shook his head. Suddenly, he spotted something lying on the ground. It was a set of panpipes, small ones. He walked over to them and took them from the ground. He held them in his hand. They barely covered it up. He shrugged and with the pipes in his hand quickly climbed the ladder. Nami was busy with a map and Luffy went inside to get a drink. Zoro walked over to Nami's side and held out the panpipes. She looked up and frowned. I found these. Do you know whose it is? He asked. She slowly shook her head, and then suddenly started to nod. Yeah, it was that girl's, the one that almost fell, she said absently, going back to her map. Zoro nodded slowly, then walked away and sat on the deck, looking out at the cobblestone port. He leaned on the mast and put his hands behind his head. He suddenly noticed Chopper's pink hat bobbing in the crowd. Then he came into view, along with Sanji and Usopp. Usopp was having difficulty carrying quite a few bags of warai. The fruit sparkled in the bright sunlight. Chopper took some bags from Usopp and made it to the deck without difficulty. Sanji took the remaining bags and also climbed up. Usopp followed, saying loudly, Oh, I could have carried all that. You guys didn't have to do that. Zoro grinned, and Sanji brought all the fruit into the kitchen. Suddenly, a muffled bang was heard in there, and Luffy sprinted out holding a warai fruit above his head. Sanji followed quickly. Luffy! Give that back! I need every single one for the dessert I'm making! Sanji yelled. Luffy screeched to a stop. He turned around. Dessert? He asked. He opened his mouth and popped the fruit in. This is dessert. What are you talking about? Usopp held his hands in his head. Luffy, don't talk with your mouth full. Luffy looked at Usopp. Sorry, Luffy replied. Nami laughed. Zoro grinned. Rhea dashed frantically around the port, looking for her pipes. How could she have lost them? She ran for about 3 minutes before she arrived at the spot of her fall. She tried to look past the feet of the passing people, but could barely see anything. She shook her head in frustration and resumed running at full speed when she heard a shout behind her. Turning, she saw the funny Jolly Roger and raised an eyebrow. Then her gaze focused on Zoro. He was waving to her. Something glinted in his hand. It was her pipes. She smiled and laughed with joy and ran up to the ship and looked up at Zoro. Zoro, can I have my pipes back, please? She shouted to him. He stopped waving and looked at her strangely. How do you know my name? He asked suspiciously. Her eyes widened and she knew she had to think up of something quick. I heard someone call your name over there. You're pretty famous, you know, she told him. He looked satisfied with that. Suddenly, Luffy poked his head over the edge. Hey, it's the girl that almost fell, he exclaimed. She started to blush. Can I have my pipes back, please? She asked again. Luffy grinned. You can come up here if you like, he invited her. Sure, she replied, and started climbing up the ladder with agility gained after so many years of climbing trees. When she reached the top, she saw Zoro by the mast, Nami over her map, and Usopp by the bow. She didn't see Chopper though, so she was safe. He had a wide grin on. Luffy popped up into her face. Hi. What's your name? I'm Monkey D. Luffy, he introduced with his hand held out. Rhea shook it tentatively. She started to say her name, but he continued. You might have seen my picture on the message board. This is my crew. He spread a hand towards the rest of the people. Nami looked up and smiled. She walked over and held out her hand. Hi, I'm Nami. What's your name? She asked kindly. My name's Rhea, she told Nami. She looked at the crew. What brings you here to Chinchima? We're not that important, she murmured. Nami frowned darkly. Luffy, the captain, poisoned our water supply on accident. It was those warai fruits. It messed up his judgment, she explained. Suddenly Chopper came out from under the deck. He was in his smaller form, and spied Rhea. He gasped, then ran to the mast behind Zoro and peeked out to look at her. Rhea blinked. And that's Chopper, Nami continued. Rhea looked back at Nami. But wasn't he a little taller? Rhea asked. She suddenly kicked herself in the head mentally for that blunder. But Nami didn't notice. Yes, he ate the fruit that makes him into a human state, she explained. Rhea sat down at a nearby table as Nami began to tell her their story. This was getting very interesting. She put her chin in her hands, listening intently while Nami talked. Chopper made sure that the girl was occupied before he inched out and sat next to Zoro. Zoro was watching the two women talk. He tilted his head in Rhea's direction. That's the girl that almost fell, Zoro explained to Chopper. She did an amazing roll before she hit the ground. Chopper nodded and watched in silence. Zoro took out her pipes and waved it so Chopper could see. These are hers. Do you think she can play well? He asked Chopper. Chopper started to shake his head. I don't can dash. He stopped midway. His blue nose started to twitch, and he sniffed the pipes. Zoro raised an eyebrow. What? He asked Chopper. That smell by the water merchant? Chopper reminded Zoro. Zoro nodded. Chopper pointed to the girl. That's her. Are there any more warai? Sanji scowled and dumped the fruits into the boiling pot. No, he answered shortly. Luffy frowned and reached into the pot. He plucked one out, and then grinned. Luffy, that's pretty hot, Sanji started to warn him. Luffy held the fruit in his hand and walked outside. The door closed. Suddenly, Sanji heard a loud howling. He smirked and looked out the window. Luffy was running back and forth on the deck. Sanji went outside. That's what you get. I already warned you, you idiot, he said condescendingly. Luffy stopped fanning his mouth. He had his head. You did? Sanji heard laughter over by the bow, and sitting across from Nami, who he must say was the most beautiful young woman on the earth, was another beautiful young woman. He ran down the stairs, then up on the other stairs, and stopped by the table. He took the girl's hand. And what may I call you, beloved lady? He asked smoothly. She looked up and quirked an eyebrow. Her long black hair trailed behind her in wisps. Rhea, she managed to say out of her surprise. Nami giggled. Sanji turned his head to look at Nami. Ah, Nami-san, he exclaimed. How much you must love me to bring another beautiful lady on the ship. He suddenly froze and raced back into the lounge. The two women looked at each other and laughed. Then Nami resumed telling Rhea the Straw Hat story. Rhea listened wholeheartedly. Usopp crept closer and sat next to Zoro. He had heard everything. I was gone, right? Chopper nodded. But why didn't you see her? He asked quietly. Some magic trick? Chopper guessed. Zoro shrugged and looked down at the panpipes. Taking out a hand from behind his head, he traced the patterns with a calloused finger. Usopp looked at them. Whoever created that is one fine artist, Usopp observed. Zoro looked up at Rhea. She laughed prettily, and Nami continued talking. Zoro suddenly noticed something odd. Usopp, where's Luffy? Usopp looked around. Good question. Suddenly, the lounge doors burst open and Luffy ran out and down the stairs. He was coming right at the group by the mast. Oh no, Zoro started to say. An impact. They all bowled over and lay sprawled on the deck. Somebody groaned. Sanji stepped out of the lounge. Dinner's ready now, he said pointedly, glaring at Luffy. Come get some. Chopper, Usopp, and Sanji sat on the ground. Sanji gave up his seat for Nami. Rhea, Luffy, Zoro, and Nami sat at the table. They all munched away, and Rhea looked at her surroundings. A nice refrigerator dado whip staff with a ram's head, all fit in perfectly. She looked down at her food. Surprisingly, it tasted very good, unlike anything she had eaten before. Who cooked this? It's really good, she complimented. Sanji looked up from the floor and grinned. I did, oh beloved Rhea. Only for you and Nami-san, he exclaimed. Zoro shook his head and continued eating. Lusty cook, muttered Usopp. Luffy was busy stuffing his mouth. Rhea smiled. She suddenly noticed Chopper giving her side glances. He quickly looked away when he saw her, and looked at Usopp, who was also giving her side glances. She frowned slightly and adjusted her pale green pants, then resumed eating. What's wrong? Nami asked. Rhea bit her lip briefly. Nothing. I'm just a little hot, she told her. She twirled a piece of hair around her finger. Not a little, very hot, said Sanji. She smiled sadly. I think I'm going to go out for some air, she told Nami. Nami nodded, and Rhea stood up. She walked out of the room and closed the doors. Then she put her elbows on the rail and looked out to the sea. She had never felt so carefree in her life. It was like she was a part of the crew. Their stories were amazing, that was true. But they accepted her. Would they do the same if they knew what she did? Wondering if Chopper had already found out, she watched the sun dip closer to the horizon. The waves calmly broke on the dock, and she went pop. A tear trickled down her cheek, and she bit back a sob. She sighed. The sound of a mournful came out instead and floated on the breeze. There was a short silence after Rhea left the room. Sanji could see Rhea's hair fly in the wind as she looked at the sea. She had such beautiful hair, but it wasn't as beautiful as Nami's. Her graceful head suddenly disappeared. Sanji choked. Nami-san! Rhea's gone! He managed to say. Nami started. What? She exclaimed. Zoro and Usopp stiffened. Then Chopper coughed for attention. Everyone was silenced. It's true, he said quietly. Nami and Sanji both looked quizzical. He drew in a deep breath and started to explain. We found out who our stalker was by the water merchant this morning, he said. Nami raised an eyebrow. It was Rhea. Nami frowned. Sanji's jaw dropped. But how could she have escaped our notice? She asked thoughtfully. Zoro shrugged. He took out her panpipes and laid them on the table. Sanji sucked in his breath. Chopper smelled her, remember? He reminded her. Nami nodded. Luffy slammed both hands on the table. There was a stalker? He asked ludicrously. Nami rolled her eyes. Chopper, what did she smell like? The whole crew quieted. He sighed sadly. Of loneliness. Rhea went whiff and ran her fingers through her hair. I hope they didn't see me, she thought to herself. With a small sigh, she opened the door and walked back in. The dinner was gone and a Warai dessert was placed on the table, served in minuscule portions, of course. Rhea sat down next to Nami. Nami pushed towards her some of the dessert, and Rhea smiled and shook her head. Thanks, but I don't like Warai, she told Nami. Nami shrugged and started to eat hers. Everyone else was already halfway finished. Rhea put an elbow on the table and rested her chin in her hands. Zoro was already finished, and Rhea caught him looking at her. She stared back. So, how do you know my name again? He asked. I heard about you and recognized you immediately, she responded. Zoro raised his eyebrows in disbelief. That's not what I heard. She raised her own. What did you hear? She asked coolly. He gazed deeper into her eyes. His own narrowed. That a little somebody followed us to the market. They even made it to the water merchant, he said casually. Rhea looked out the window. And who was that? She asked quietly. Zoro shrugged nonchalantly. I don't know, he began. Her eyes darted to his. Maybe you do. She sucked in her breath and looked into her lap, then out the window again. Time slowed, and her thoughts tumbled about in her mind. How did they know? It must have been Chopper. What if they did know already? It wasn't that big of a deal. But did they know she followed them? There was no use hiding that. But what if? Would they? How could? She screwed her eyes shut and breathed deeply. All her doubts disappeared. She opened her eyes and looked into Zoro's. Yes. I was the one who followed you, she said quietly. Zoro smiled smugly, and she heard the crew let out a collective breath. So they knew. After that statement, everything spilled out. But you ask how I did it without being seen, she said rather than questioned. They all nodded. She continued. I have the powers of a devil fruit. Zoro's eyes widened and Nami was in deep thought. Usopp and Chopper nodded in unison and stroked their chins. Ah, they murmured in understanding. Sanji brought his hands to his. No matter what, dear Rhea, your beauty will always be undimmed in my eyes, he exclaimed. Rhea shook her head sadly. That's the problem. Now you see me. A faint pop was heard and she disappeared. No, you don't, said a wavering voice. Sanji seemed to snap out of it. What? Nami gasped, and Zoro sat up straight. Nami felt a breeze on her face, and Sanji turned quickly after he felt a tap on his shoulder. Usopp squawked as his nose was pulled, and Chopper grabbed his hat as he felt a tug on it. Luffy, on the other hand, ate through all of this. He reached for his last piece of meat when it started to float away. Luffy pointed to it and said, Sanji, what did you do to the meat? It's still alive. He heard a trilling giggle and grabbed his meat. Zoro felt a pull on his bandana around his arm and quickly grabbed the air. His hands brushed against smooth skin, and he closed his fingers around it. Hey, let go of me, yelped Rhea. What really came out was, Hey, let go of me. Huh. In his confusion, Zoro let go. Thias is what I sound like when I transform, she explained. I can also float too. She pulled on Zoro's earring for good measure. He caught her wrist again and didn't release her. She strained, but he was too strong, and he pulled out her panpipes with the other hand and waved it where he thought her face was. I'll be keeping these for a while for what you did back near the merchant. He grinned and put it back in his shirt. Rhea materialized and landed on the deck with a whiff. What? You can't do that, she protested indignantly. Nami smiled. Usopp and Chopper were still open-mouthed at her transformation. Sanji lit a cigarette and drew in deeply, looking out the window. He leaned back on the wall. It's getting pretty dark, he observed. Luffy had seen the panpipes. Can you play them? Rhea nodded and looked at Zoro's in frustration. He grinned and sat down across from him. Well, I can't now, she muttered darkly. Zoro smirked wickedly. But I can sing. Do you want to hear? Luffy nodded, and she began. Oh, when I cry, I eat warai. From Chinchima. The sea hates those who eat the cursed fruit. She began to tear up, and she went pop and continued in a haunting voice. Of Chinchima's womb. So be wary the doomed. Then we all eat warai. And laugh till we die. She finished and looked at the straw hats. Luffy was busy drooling in his sleep. Usopp and Chopper applauded, Sanji even more so. Zoro looked strangely at her, probably because of her voice, and Nami was again thinking deeply. Rhea, that part about the fruit of Chinchima's womb, she began to ask. An explosion was heard, and the ship rocked. What the dash? Sanji started to say. Nami and Zoro ran outside, along with Usopp and Chopper hot on his heels. Sanji sprinted after them. That left Rhea and Luffy, who was still snoozing. Rhea grabbed his shoulders and shook them. Luffy! Luffy! Wake up! Something's happened! She shouted. Luffy jerked awake. What dash? He wiped the drool from his mouth and sprang up. He then ran outside. Rhea went after him. They both stood still, trying to peer into the darkness. The silence unnerved her, and the wind eddied eerily. Luffy broke the silence. Where'd everybody go? He asked quietly. Rhea shook her head slowly. I don't know, Luffy, but something doesn't seem right, she murmured. A piece of paper suddenly fluttered down from above, and Luffy extended an arm and grabbed it. He brought it up to his face, then dropped his arm and clenched his fists. His head was bowed, and the straw hat covered his eyes. Rhea took the paper and read it. She gasped. Be at the orchard closest to the mountain. When the moon reaches its peak. Or you will never see them again. She held a hand to mouth. She had been there before. Luffy, she started to say. He looked up and into her eyes. His own burned with fury. Rhea, he said quietly. She looked at him. Yes, Luffy? Rhea, he said again. Will you help me get them back? There was a short pause. I will do everything to help you, Luffy, she replied vehemently. Luffy's mouth set into a grim line. Then let's go. Chopper turned in his sleep. He had always loved sleeping. His bed was always so cold and stony. He sat up. Where was his bed? More important than that, where was his hat? He scrambled to his feet and yelled at the top of his lungs. "Where is my hat?" Someone nearby groaned in the darkness. "Hey, where's the ship?" someone asked. There was a faint shuffling and a small thump. "Quit grabbing my ass," someone else snarled. It sounded like Zoro. "That was my nose. And I can't see." "Oh my God! Are there monsters in here?" a voice screamed hysterically. "Where is Nami-san? I need her," someone started to say. "Usopp, stop screaming," a female voice muttered. "Nami-san!" someone yelled. A large woof was heard. "Stop running into walls, you lusty cook," another voice patronized. A grabbing sound was audible. "Where the hell are my swords? Where's my hat? Where's the ship? Nami-san!" "Shut up, all of you!" Nami yelled. Everyone quieted. "Okay, say something when I name you." "Sanji." "Here, my love." "Usopp." "Here." "Chopper." "Where is my hat?" "Zoro." "Bastards took my swords." "Luffy." Only silence was audible in the darkness. "Maybe he's sleeping," Usopp suggested. Chopper shook his head. Well, he knew he did, but the others didn't see him. "I don't smell him. He's not here," he stated. Chopper scratched his head. "Nami, what happened?" Nami sighed. "Well, from what I remember, there was an explosion, and then we all ran out. Then there was darkness." Usopp breathed out. "So where are we?" he asked quietly. Nami shrugged in the darkness. "In a cell of some sort. Luffy is still on the ship though, with our." Suddenly she squeaked. Everyone stiffened. "The locator. It's gone!" Laughter echoed through the darkness. "Indeed," said a male voice in a light and casual tone. "Who are you and what do you want with us?" Nami asked furiously. "Who am I?" he continued. "I am a collector of some sort. And I don't want anything with Yoha," said in a disgusted voice. "I just want something from you." "What do you want?" "It's wanted and have, darling. I already have 'em. Let's see cigarettes," Sanji muttered under his breath. "Swords," Zoro swore loudly. "Hats, bags, locatorso, and I forgot. Devil fruit. They bring quite a lot of cash into my pockets and are so peculiar." He chuckled. "And that brings another thing to my mind. You have one other crew member that I haven't got a hold of yet, true?" "What do you want to do with him?" Nami asked quickly. "Oh, so we're intrigued now, are we, dear? It won't harm in telling you now. I've dropped a note to the monkey. Wait, what am I saying? This is a common mistake many people with the same goals as my own make. You'll just escape with the knowledge that a monkey ghost holding a warai is the key to the fruit of Chinchuma's womb, which is the devil fruit. After he enters, so can I. So can anybody else." Nami gasped. "But you don't know that," he continued. "You'll try to stop me if I tell you. But the location of our little meeting is a secret." He chuckled. "No one knows that the warai orchard that grows closest to the mountain is by a square orange house." Usopp nudged Chopper and stifled laughter. He went on. "And even if you found out by pure luck that we are going to meet when the moon is at its peak, it'll be too late. I'll have made off with the devil fruit and sold them to power-hungry rulers or low self-esteem millionaires." There was a small silence. "Look at the time. Well, catch a few winks in my absence, won't you? I have a date to catch." There was a sudden pause, and the straw hats just sat there. Then his voice cut in. "Oh, and don't think I'm not watching you. You won't even make it to your precious objects, which are coincidentally down the left side of this exit. Yes, I know how you outday." Is it just me?" Usopp began to say. "Or was the guy giving us hints, or was he being extremely stupid?" Nami snorted. "I think the latter, Usopp," she replied sardonically. She glanced around. Well, she knew she did, but no one saw her. "Chopper, where did the guy's voice originate from?" Nami asked. He clip-clopped in the darkness. Suddenly, a small part of the wall opened and a slit of yellow light slipped inside. Then it grew as Chopper nudged the door even harder. Everyone held their arms up to block out the intrusive light. After they got used to it, they crept out into a hall, Victorian red carpet, dim candelabras, and walls of dark, polished wood. "Down the left side, eh? I need a smoke," Sanji muttered. They started to walk cautiously down the left hall, completely unaware of a slim, dark figure emerging from the walls behind them and stepping into pace with them. The wooden door at the end of the corridor beckoned. Luffy and Rhea jumped out of the ship. He adjusted his straw hat, started to turn left and walk. "Luffy, it's this way," Rhea called out to him. He turned around in silence and followed her. She walked straight down the street, and they went in silence. Her hair trailed after her like wisps of smoke. "Luffy, what will you do if you lose them completely?" The moon soared slowly up the dark sky. "I won't lose them. They won't let me." After a few minutes, Rhea noticed Moon starting to stop. She gasped. "Luffy, it's near the peak." Luffy looked up, and then looked at her. "Is there a faster way? We have to get there," he asked desperately. Rhea seemed to ponder. Then she sighed with frustration. "Luffy, hold my hand." He raised both his eyebrows. "What?" Rhea blinked, then rolled her eyes. "Not like that, pervert, it's gonna get us there quicker." Luffy shrugged and grabbed her hand. It felt dry. She laced her fingers with his. "Just to let you know, I never tried this before." "Let's go," he said impatiently. Rhea then went pop. This transformation she went through was unlike any other. It took her no effort to change herself, but after changing Luffy, that was different. She felt only a little weaker, like when you hold a dictionary above your head until you feel the strain. Luffy looked around. "What is this?" he yelped. His hand started to slip. "Don't let go!" Rhea yelled, and she tightened her grip on his hand. Then they both kicked off and floated off towards the mountain. Faster, faster, Rhea thought to herself. She felt both of them speed up. She glanced at Luffy and had to stop the bubbling laughter. His mouth was dropped, and he gazed around. "Don't look down," she warned him. He did anyways. "This is cool," he exclaimed. She grinned and the orchards came into view. They lowered in altitude and landed on the grass next to a warai tree. Luffy let go of her hand and he appeared more clearly. He grabbed a warai fruit and was looking at it. Then he pocketed it. Crickets chirped pleasantly, but the smothering darkness surrounding the faint light from the moon wasn't pleasant at all. She looked up at the moon, and it still hadn't reached its peak. She was about to transform when a light voice started to speak. "Right on the dot, as usual, my little monkey. The question is, where is your ghost?" Something whistled past Rhea's ear, and she ducked instinctively. When she looked at Luffy, she saw a thin dart sticking out of his arm. "Rhea," he murmured and slumped to the ground. Rhea gasped, and crouched next to him. A hooded figure emerged from the darkness. Rhea was about to tell him to back off when suddenly the figure stooped down to examine Luffy, completely oblivious to Rhea. "Where is your ghost?" it repeated menacingly. Of course. She hadn't transformed back. The figure's head turned into a swirling darkness, and then his whole body disappeared. It had the devil fruit powers too? She wasted no time and laced her fingers with Luffy's. With the other hand she pulled out the dart, and Luffy's image dimmed. She felt a little weaker, and held him in her arms like a sleeping baby. Which he almost was, anyways. She bit her lip and hiked over to the familiar spot near the bushes. She ran through them and into the tunnel, constantly looking over her shoulder. She proceeded through, and ended up inside the huge cavern. She paused underneath the devil fruit tree, and looked behind her. No trace of the attacker. Why didn't he follow? She readjusted her hands in Luffy's. Suddenly, she heard something fall from above and a square fruit that felt like 45 kilograms. She fell to her knees and ate in agony. Seeing stars and devil fruit, the last thought she had before she slipped into darkness was, what a stupid way to black out. The Straw Hats walked slowly down the candelabra-lit corridor. They all were wary and glanced at every shadow they passed. The door grew closer, and Nami turned the gold knob. She poked her head in and gasped. The layout of the room was like a museum. Inside unlocked glass boxes were objects, both peculiar and common. Stay together now, Nami warned. They wandered down the rows, looking for their objects. They soon came upon a row with many hats hanging and displayed on hooks and hat stands, accompanied with labels. Usopp gasped when he saw an empty hook labeled Straw Hat's hat. Chopper searched frantically, racing from display to display. Suddenly, he shouted with joy and grabbed his pink top hat from a stand. He held it in his hooves, and then suddenly froze. His eyes widened in shock as his nose twitched. He carefully held the hat as far away from him as possible, and then shook it violently. Immediately he transformed into a reindeer and crushed the black widow spider that dropped to the floor. He growled, then transformed into his smaller form and set the hat between his antlers. The rest of the straw hat stood transfixed and stared at the tiny spider's corpse. Usopp broke the silence. "Oh Lord! Oh my God! There are monsters!" Zoro scowled and whacked him on the head. "Shut up or there will be, long nose," he warned darkly. Usopp quieted, but his quivering knees said everything. Nami rolled her eyes, and Sanji ran a hand through his blonde hair. "One treasure down, for more to go," Nami sighed. Zoro coughed. 7. "I have 3. Whatever. Let's go." As the group wandered down the hall, they were unaware of a dark figure that had advanced from behind a hat stand. It swiped the exact spot where Zoro's head had been. Chopper's ear twitched, and he scratched it. They stepped cautiously into the next row. It was a display of pipes, tobacco, and cigarettes. Sanji's eyes widened and his pace quickened. His long arm extended and snatched a pack of cigarettes from a table. He examined them closely, then handed the pack to Chopper. Chopper sniffed them and gagged. He coughed weakly, and when he recovered, shook his head to Sanji. Sanji looked very crestfallen, but then brightened when Chopper drew one cigarette and handed it to Sanji. He lit it and drew in deeply, exhaling with contentment. Zoro sighed and they proceeded. The rows slowly phased from inhalants to firearms and weapons. Many of the straw hats were befuddled at the use of the weapons on display. Usopp wondered over a few. "Angel arm?" he murmured, inspecting a silver gun. Sanji shrugged, still enjoying his smoke. Zoro quirked an eyebrow at a sword called a sakabato. The sharp edge was reversed. It was a peculiar but bizarrely graceful sword. He fingered his earrings. Somewhat like Rhea. He shook his green head slowly. Now where did that thought come from? He dismissed it, and went back examining other swords. Where were his katanas? Nami held a beautiful hair stick with strands at the end. It gleamed, and was wickedly sharp. She grinned and twirled her hair into a bun, then stuck it through. She made sure not to poke herself. Sanji noticed the procedure and ran over. "Nami-san! You look so beautiful!" he exclaimed. She patted her bun. "Yes, I know," she replied lightly. Zoro turned his head but still no sign of them. He was desperate, and let out a small breath of frustration. A metallic glint caught his eyes, and he caught sight of them. He walked over and saw them. Placed in sword holders were Kuina's sword, Snow, and the cursed ghost. It suddenly flashed purple, and he grinned. The others gathered behind him, looking at his swords. He glanced at Chopper, who was tense with concentration. Zoro shrugged and his hand drew closer to his katanas. Chopper's ear twitched and the dark figure behind them struck. Rhea woke up to see Zoro stooped over her. He helped her up. It was too bright, and she couldn't see. "Where am I?" she asked tentatively. His arms entwined her slim waist, and he drew her closer to him. She looked at him in confusion. "With me." He smiled and slowly brought his pleasing face towards hers. She closed her eyes and... "Rhea! Rhea!" She opened them and felt moisture on her cheeks. Had she been crying? Suddenly, she felt Luffy's head loll on her shoulders. She sprang back and sprawled on the grass. Luffy fell limply on top of her. "Get off me, you pervert," she said in a muffled voice. Luffy didn't budge. Luffy mongaged to say in a slurred voice. "Look!" Before she could respond, the devil fruit next to her was picked up. She gasped and looked up, but the worker was oblivious to her. She struggled to her feet, along with Luffy still in her arms. Her head hurt so badly. She managed to smile at the dream, but wondered why she dreamed it. But what she saw next emptied all her thoughts of Zoro and her head. The cavern swarmed with workers stripping trees of their fruit. Armed soldiers patrolled the cavern and overseed the work. It looked like they were shipping away the fruit. But why? She glanced at the nearest crate and noticed a majestic lion stamped on the edge, with Lion's Enterprise written underneath it. She looked around some more and noticed a rifle leaning against the crate, with a soldier sipping his drink. He was busy watching the workers. She crept closer towards the rifle, Luffy still in her arms. Then she was right behind him. Her hand reached out and closed around the barrel. A wave of helplessness hit her, and the world spun. She groaned and fell to her knees. Then she let go and staggered away, feeling her strength return slowly. She held her head in her hands. "See," stunned Luffy murmured. She looked at him. "Do you feel better?" she asked him. He nodded. That was an improvement. So all the soldiers had seized stone? She had to look for a way to stop these people. Obviously they knew what they were doing. Or did they? She scanned the clearing and spotted a bamboo bridge that stretched across a ravine she could have jumped across. The workers laden with fruit couldn't though. So they walked on the bridge. Then she had an idea. She kicked off and floated towards the bridge with Luffy. She rose higher and higher. Then she looked down. "Luffy, will you get a bruise if you fall from this height?" she asked. He shook his head and looked down. Then he adjusted his hat. That was an even better improvement. She curled up into a ball, with Luffy underneath her, and transformed them both. They fell at a fearful speed and crashed into the bridge. She transformed back immediately, and they floated lazily above the ruins. Soldiers rushed to the scene, and the work flow halted. She landed on the grass at the other side. Suddenly she heard things behind her. She gasped and turned around. "Freeze!" the soldiers ordered. She glanced around desperately, then gasped again. Both of Luffy's hands dropped limply at her side. He grinned sheepishly and wiggled one of his fingers, then dropped his head on her shoulder. She grinned and assumed an air of panic. Her wispy hair helped a bit. Okay, all right," she cried out hysterically. She started to break down and sob. "I didn't mean to. Honestly," she sobbed. The soldiers gestured with their rifles. "That won't fool us. Now get up. Now," they yelled. She suddenly quieted and looked at them with her icy blue eyes. "You sure you want us to?" she asked softly. One of the soldiers raised an eyebrow. A second later Luffy sprang up. The soldier's last glimpse was an arm that stretched unusually far and a wide and toothy grin. The dark figure's knife sped to Zoro's side and met Chopper's antlers. He was in reindeer form and pushed down on the ground with his hooves. The assailant slid backwards, then tried to get in a few stabs. Chopper's head moved quickly and blocked them. He suddenly noticed another glint moving towards him, and he tilted his head to deflect it. The first assailant's knife went quickly to his open neck, and then clattered to the floor as Sanji calmly nailed him in the stomach with his legs. Hands in his pockets, he whammed the guy on the back down to the floor with his other leg. The assailant crumpled to the ground. Zoro wasted no time and grabbed his katanas. He took his bandana and tied it around his head, katana clenched in his mouth. Then he spun around, swords ready to deflect the coming blow. The coming blows, actually. 3 swords were brought down on him, and he blocked them. He started to whirl, swords flashing, too quick for the eye. Barely 3 seconds passed before he paused, head bowed with the katana in his mouth. His 3 attackers stiffened, and then the sound of ripping fabric was followed by 3 thuds to the ground. "TCH," he said disappointedly, smirking behind the katana. He glanced around and noticed Chopper standing over his fallen attacker. Sanji raced towards Nami. She was busy with hers. Her hair stick was out, and she was continuously blocking dagger stabs with it. Her eyes looked frantically for a weak spot. She suddenly started to trip. She smoothly stuck her stick in the attacker's leg while falling, just where the hamstring was. Her attacker screamed and fell. As he fell, she rolled and double-kicked his head, then side-punched him. He spun and fell to the ground like a sack of potatoes. She stood up and brushed her hands, pinning her hair back with the stick. Sanji looked surprised. "Remember that, Sanji," she told him smoothly. "Looks can kill." Zoro made a scoffing sound and sheathed his swords, glad to feel the familiar weight by his sides. Ghost flashed purple. Then he frowned. "Nami?" he called. She looked up. "Where's Usopp?" "Oh God!" Usopp screamed hysterically. He ran down the aisle with his hands in the air, his eyes scanning for his bag. His feet beat out a rhythm, and so did his pursuers. "Oh God, help me!" he screamed again. Suddenly he spied a tan bag hanging on the wall. He snatched it and resumed running, his hand rummaging in it. He grabbed a handful of transparent marbles and threw them on the ground. Then he stopped and turned around to survey his work. They broke on the spot and showered his attacker with glass and green mist. The attacker choked, and then advanced menacingly towards Usopp. Usopp quickly fitted his slingshot and fired. Usopp's air stars. The attacker dodged them easily, but screamed in agony as they exploded in midair. Usopp laughed. The attacker snarled and ran faster. 3, 2, 1 baby, Usopp counted. The attacker suddenly stiffened, then choked. He fell to the ground writhing and started to scream. Then he fell silent. Usopp planted his hands on his hips. Usopp, the brave warrior of the seas, has triumphed again. He noticed a small glass sphere on a pedestal with a white piece of paper attached to the wristband. Other spheres were around, were 7 pillows nearby, each holding a ball, Dragon Ball, except for the 7th. He shrugged, grabbed the locator, and headed back to the sword aisle. Nami shook her head slowly. "Per Usopp," she said softly. Zoro made a disbelieving noise. "That wasn't him, you know," he muttered. He ran a hand through his green hair and peered around. "Zoro's right," Chopper piped up. "Usopp has more of a whine to his yells," Sanji added thoughtfully. "It's whiny 'cause of his nose," Zoro said, smirking. Suddenly something flew at his head and struck the sheathed sword he lifted to block it. Usopp stepped out. "I'm happy to know I was missed by somebody," he said dryly, glaring at Zoro. Usopp drew something out of his bag and gave it to Nami. She gasped. "It's the locator. And there's a note," Nami murmured. The others crowded around her. It read, "The locator's done setting. And so has the sun. I'm off with the fruits. Now my work is done. And your little monkey is stuck in the cavern. Why, he could get himself lost in a tavern. This rhyme is bad. I know you complain. But the quicker you reach him, the less chance he'll be slain. We'll meet again. Yours truly, Mr. Lion. P.S. Watch out for Panther." Usopp sighed. "That was awful," he said. Chopper nodded. "His name is Mr. Lion?" "He did sort of purr when we were talking to him," Nami said observantly. Then she turned to Chopper. "Chopper, can you find the way to Rhea and Luffy?" He nodded and stayed still for a moment, then raced down the aisle and turned left. The Straw Hats followed quickly. Luffy's arm snapped back and he stretched it. He relished the movement. "Ah!" he sighed with contentment. Rhea picked herself up and dusted her knees. She suddenly looked back at Luffy with narrowed eyes. "Luffy," she began menacingly, "when was it when you were able to move?" Luffy pondered. "Back by the gun," he said bluntly. Her jaw dropped, then she started to grit her teeth. "I carried you for how long?" Luffy shrugged. "You had your own plans. I wanted to see what you were going to do," he said. Then he put his hand on his straw hat. "I need to know all my crew's styles." Rhea gasped and stared at him. "What do you mean, all, my dear monkey?" a dark voice purred. Rhea transformed and whirled wildly to Luffy's side. She transformed back. Dark shadows swirled in the spot where she had stood. The shadows came together and formed a lean, tall man. He was pale, and pupils were slits. Everything else about him blended in with the darkness, even his voice. "Your crew are all long gone now, or else my name isn't Panther. Thanks to my men," he said softly. He started to pace like a cat. "My brother wanted to pay me a % of the money from the fruit shipment of his, but I insisted on free of charge. Killing you will be." He licked his lips. "Easy." He suddenly disappeared into the darkness. He appeared at Luffy's side and proceeded to stick Luffy with a small knife. Luffy moved quickly and dodged the blow. He put a hand on the ground and pushed off, springing into the air. The knife slid into the ground he left. Twin gum-gum pistols. His arm stretched, and it shot towards Panther. He evaded it quickly, but was blown to the other side of the clearing as the other arm made contact with his face. Panther rose amid the dust and snarled, then disappeared again. He suddenly appeared right in front of Rhea and drove the knife into her. She gasped. It had gone right through her. Literally. A faint mist surrounded the knife in her. She didn't even use her powers yet. Panther's sneering face turned into a confused one. She bared her teeth and stuck a finger in his eye. Panther staggered back, howling in pain. Then she kneed him between the legs. He crumpled, and Luffy pounded him into the ground some more for good measure. "Don't mess with the unexplained," she muttered darkly. She suddenly heard something behind her and spun around. Then smiled in relief as she saw the other Straw Hats emerge from the tunnel. They came over and inspected the damage. Sanji took a drag, Nami was busy yelling at Luffy, and Usopp looked closely at Panther. He then took out an iron hammer and whacked him just to make sure. Zoro sauntered over and also inspected Panther, his hands resting on his katanas. Chopper sniffed him and gagged. After he recovered, he managed to say, "Lion's relative." Then he walked away. "He almost ran you through back there," Zoro remarked. He looked at her strangely. She narrowed her blue eyes and looked at him. "He did, actually," she said coolly. He raised his eyebrows in an incredulous way. Nami walked over to them. "You didn't tell us that you could pass through things, Rhea," Nami said observantly. Rhea nodded her head in agreement. "I didn't know I could," she murmured and looked up to see Nami scan their surroundings. "It must be the fruits radiating something," she muttered thoughtfully. Then she suddenly looked at Rhea. "Aren't ghosts made up of some kind of energy?" she asked her. Rhea shrugged. "Ectoplasm. It gives you telekinetic abilities, I think." Rhea shrugged again. The others started to gather by them. Nami waved a hand impatiently. "Here, Rhea, try this," Nami whispered into Rhea's ear. Her eyes widened in surprise and she started to giggle. All the others were mystified. Especially Zoro. He swore he had heard the word katana. His eyes widened in shock and his hands darted to his side. Only Kuina's was left. The other two were busy spinning in circles, chasing each other. Zoro's jaw fell in shock, and then he started to chase them around the clearing. Nami laughed hard, and the others were gaping at the spectacle. He stole a glance at Rhea, whose eyes were darting back and forth. He suddenly grinned at an idea of his and started to creep up behind her silently. Then he covered her eyes up with his hands. She gasped. "Gimme back my swords or you," he chuckled. He never got to finish. The swords, sheathed of course, sped through her and made contact with Zoro, who was behind her. Only one sword hit him, though, so it didn't hurt as bad. Ghost twinkled mischievously. Zoro stood up scowling and rubbed his shoulder. Rhea turned around and smirked evilly, then turned back to Nami. She was laughing so hard she was holding her sides. Usopp applauded, and Chopper looked wide-eyed at Rhea. Sanji grinned amusedly, and Luffy could barely hold his excitement in. "Rhea! Rhea! Do it again!" he cried out. "I prefer not," Zoro muttered darkly. She turned to look at him again, and he glared daggers at her. Now he had to guard his swords from Luffy, Usopp, and this girl. He sighed. The experience was exhilarating. Why hadn't she known of this before? A thought struck her. "Luffy, give me your fruit, please," she asked him quickly. He hid his head, then reached into his pockets and took out a warai. There were no bruises and it twinkled. "Why isn't it all mashed up?" Usopp asked in wonder. "A chemical reaction with the moonlight," Sanji explained. "That's why it's such a rarity. It stays firm and fresh for a while." "It must be these," Nami murmured. Rhea pocketed it. She suddenly noticed Chopper standing stiff, and his eyes closed. "Chopper, what's wrong?" she asked softly. Zoro unsheathed his swords an inch. Snow glinted, and Sanji straightened. "We have company." Chopper ate his head and the sound of many feet thundered in the cavern. "Between 1,000 or 2 are entering," he stated. Nami tried to peer about. "Chopper, where are the exits?" Nami asked. "What are you talking about?" Luffy cut in. "We can handle this." He stretched his arm. Nami shook her head. "They're armed with sea stone guns. I don't want to risk it," she told him. "Let's run for it, oh God!" Usopp screamed. "Who cares about sea stone? Let's go!" Luffy exclaimed. Nami sighed. "Sanji, can you bring him with us?" she asked. He jumped and gripped Luffy. "Only for you, Nami-san." Zoro rolled his eyes, and Nami gestured to Chopper. "Lead the way." The Straw Hats took to a run, racing forwards from the ravine. Bare fruit trees streaked past them, and Chopper galloped steadily. Soon a bright light came into view. They ran out onto open grass and paused. They were out. The breeze smelled like the salty sea. "Aya!" Nami shrieked. She backed off from the edge. Zoro peered over and grimaced. They were on a cliff above the sea. Waves crashed onto the deadly rocks below. They looked so puny from the crew's height. Usopp braved a glance and also screamed. "God save us!" Rhea swallowed nervously. "So how do we get off?" The distant thunder of footsteps grew louder. Sanji deposited his cigarette in its case, and Luffy cracked his knuckles. "We don't." In less than half a minute, and the thundering was a roar. Usopp shook. "Here we go," he said shakily. Rhea bit her lip nervously. Even if they did win the fight, how would they get off? Her thoughts raced. Jumping? Climbing down? Flying? Flying, it clicked. Rhea suddenly felt very dumb. "Oh, I'm so stupid." She emphasized that statement by a smack on her forehead. The Straw Hats looked at her. Then the soldiers' heads came into view. "I know a way to get us off," she cried out. Luffy looked back at her, his arms stretched behind him. "What dash?" He yelped and his arm rocketed up and missed the soldiers, and then whammed into the rock overhang. A large rumble began, and rocks started to fall on the soldiers, who were shouting in pain. "Nice," Usopp muttered. They all looked at Rhea expectantly. The cliff started to shake. Hold hands everyone," she said shakily as the ground buckled. They did, and she grabbed Zoro's on her left and Nami's on her right. She screwed her eyes shut and went pop. "Oh my god," Nami murmured in wonder. Rhea opened her eyes and looked down just in time to see the cliff crash into the sea. A wave of weakness hit her. She had transformed 6 beings. Her head throbbed and she pulled them all forward. They floated to the left side of the island where the port was. "Shit," Sanji said in a strangled voice. He looked up quickly. Oh god, Usopp ed, his eyes shut tight. "Shut up, wuss," Zoro said to Usopp, who paid him no heed. Rhea grinned, but it was white from her face as her head began to swim. She needed to keep them transformed to float, but it was draining her strength. The port came into view. She saw the Going Merry and aimed at it. They were about 50 feet above the port. The ship started to blur, and her vision fogged up. The straw hats started falling. Rhea's hair streamed, and Luffy held his hat with his free hand. "Shit!" Sanji exclaimed. "Rhea! Rhea!" Zoro yelled loudly. He jerked his arm violently, and her head lifted. Her eyes opened a slit, and then widened slightly when she saw him. While her eyes closed, her head lolled and rested on his shoulder. Nami screamed, and the straw hats closed their eyes at the nearing cobblestones. They hit the ground. None perished. "Why aren't we hurt?" Chopper asked as he rose shakily. He examined the crew for bruises. "I felt a split-second pause, then we fell about 8 feet, Usopp stated. Sanji made a disbelieving noise. "Your eyes were closed." "How would you know?" Sanji scoffed. Usopp started to reply when Nami suddenly screamed. "Ray!" she cried out. Rhea slumped forward. Zoro caught her willowy body before she hit the ground. He held her carefully while Nami tried to revive her. "What happened?" "Chopper!" He rushed over to Rhea's limp form and examined her carefully. Zoro studied her face, and it was strangely serene. He glanced around, and then gently brushed a hair out of her face with his rough hand. Chopper finished and stood up. "She's in shock," he said urgently. "We need to get on the ship right away and go." Luffy was watching quietly nearby. "She'll be all right, won't she?" Luffy asked Chopper. Chopper shrugged. "It might take half a day or 1 week. It all depends on her strength," Chopper said sadly. Luffy nodded with understanding, and then jumped up. "What are we waiting for? Let's go!" He jumped in the ship. Nami looked back at Rhea, and then climbed up. Sanji followed quickly, and Chopper right after him. Zoro placed Rhea's body in front of him and held her with one arm while climbing up. He reached the top and saw Chopper beckon into the women's quarters. Zoro hesitated and then shrugged. He followed Chopper in. Nami was waiting. "Lay her on the couch," Chopper instructed. Zoro did so, and stepped back. Her hair spilled onto the pillow and she breathed steadily. Suddenly, her eyes flickered. Zoro and Nami looked at her intently. Rhea sniffled. A tear made a trail on her cheek. Nami reached down and wiped it away. Nami looked sadly at Rhea, and then walked up to the deck, leaving Chopper and Zoro with Rhea. They felt the ship lurch. "When will she wake up again, Chopper?" Zoro asked. Chopper looked up from the medicines he was mixing. "From a day to a week. Even if she does wake up, that ordeal wasn't entirely the cause of her shock," Chopper said observantly. Zoro looked quizzically at him. "What was it then?" he inquired, now interested. Chopper shrugged. "Something. You can ask her yourself after she wakes," he said with finality. He returned to his procedure. Zoro walked over to the stairs, and then looked back at Rhea. He shook his head and stepped up into the storage deck, then out into the present chaos. It was past midnight, but no one was tired yet. "Rhea isn't going to die, Luffy! Calm down!" Nami yelled. Zoro looked wildly for the captain, and then was bowled over by Luffy racing towards the storage deck, the room that held the entrance to the women's quarters. "Idiot, watch it!" Zoro said vehemently, walking over to his favorite sleeping space. "Rhea! Don't die!" Luffy screamed from below. Muffled shouts and bangs were heard, and then Luffy raced out again, Chopper on his heels. Chopper bellowed, his head down and Atlas right behind Luffy. "Hey!" Luffy screamed. Nami sighed from the bow and consulted the map. She looked at it for a moment, and then she walked over to Zoro and leaned on the reel. "So, what do you think of Rhea?" Nami asked innocently. Zoro opened one eye. "I was just going to ask you the same," Zoro replied in the same tone. Nami frowned thoughtfully. She saved Luffy," Nami began. "Like that's hard," Zoro muttered. "She went along with Luffy to go find us. I think she would be a great asset to the crew," Nami finished. She waited expectantly for Zoro to begin. It took a few seconds before he spoke up. "I haven't seen her in action by herself, but with no weapon, well, I guess she's good. Good reflexes. I think she needs a weapon. If she joins, that is," he added hastily. Nami looked at him. "So that's all you think about her? How good she reacts in fights," Nami said accusingly. Zoro shrugged. "Yeah. What else is there?" Nami shook her head hopelessly. "Never mind. What did you mean about if she joins?" "Luffy wants her to," she said while pointing at a Luffy running about in hysterics about Rhea. "He said something about how the process of getting into shock wasn't due to the thing she did to us on the cliff. It's something else," he told her. There was a silence. The others had retired down to their room. "It'll take 5 days to get to the next island. I'm sure she'll know by then, or earlier," Nami said confidently. Zoro shrugged again and closed his eyes. He heard Nami walk away. 5 days, he murmured. That would be enough to see how she acts. He suddenly looked forward to that. Perhaps she had enough fighting prowess to match his. He stood up and went down into the men's quarters. He found the others in their hammocks, snoring. He slipped into his, and his last thought was a ghostly figure in a martial arts stance. Its hair streamed wildly, its body calm. The soulful blue eyes gazed at him intently, and then sleep took him. Nami peered over to look at Zoro's back. Our eager little swordsman, eh? She stifled a laugh and gazed at the rosy horizon. The deck was quiet, and the cold bit her. She went down to her room below and Chopper left to watch the ship. Before he left, he instructed her to take the liquid in the bowl and drop it in. Rhea's also told her that he had left her belongings, which they took before leaving, in the lounge. Nami pulled down the hammock and lay down. The ship creaked and rocked quietly. Rhea opened her eyes and saw a ceiling. And it wasn't hers. She tried to swallow and her mouth tasted like warai. Sunshine shone in from the stairs. Stairs? She bolted upright and regretted it instantly. She ate in pain and sank back into the pillows. She wanted to get to the sun, to the warmth. Standing up slowly, she hobbled to the stairs and ascended them at a painfully slow rate. She made it to the storage deck, opened the door, and her knees gave way to the warm wood. She smiled happily, curled up, and fell asleep. 2 days, and she's still not awake, Nami grumbled. She glanced around. Sanji was busy cooking lunch, and Usopp was telling the amazed Chopper more telltale stories. Luffy sat on the bow, and Zoro was busy working out on the roof. And what about Rhea? "Zoro, could you please check on Rhea?" Nami called out to him. Zoro groaned. "Why should I if you're closer?" he called back. Nami pretended to ponder. "Wheelio, about the debt you owe me," Nami started. She didn't even get to finish as Zoro grumbled something about hell and Rose. She smiled evilly and turned back to her maps. Zoro carried his weights down the stairs from the roof and walked towards the women's quarters. 2742, 2-. Zoro gaped at the sight of Rhea curled like a cat in the sun on the deck. "Is she all right?" Nami asked from the other side of the deck. Zoro glanced around. Yeah, she's fine," he said quickly. He squatted down by Rhea and nudged her. "Hey, wake up. Are you all right?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. He nudged her harder. She didn't budge. He sighed and put down his weights, then reached an arm out to lift her and carry her downstairs. His hands passed right through her. He muttered. Rhea suddenly rolled over to face him and opened one icy blue eye. "I can get up myself, thanks," she said dryly. She rose unsteadily, walked out to the main deck, and then she held the rail for support. Zoro was right behind her. "See?" she asked him. She suddenly gasped and tipped over the rail off the ship. "Shit!" he exclaimed and tried to catch her. His hands caught air and she slipped off. He looked at the sea in shock. Suddenly he then felt a tug on his earring. He grabbed the air and felt smooth skin. Then he turned around and saw Rhea smiling. "I guess you don't see," she said with a wide grin. Zoro scowled and felt a pat on his back. He turned around and saw no one there. He growled and spun around to see Rhea walking up the steps and waving to him. Zoro spotted Nami, along with Usopp, who were also looking at him. And it looked like they had trouble breathing. He raised his hands up. "What?" he asked them angrily. Nami and Usopp burst out laughing, and Zoro sighed and picked up his weights, starting again. Luffy bolted up and ran in the lounge. Usopp rushed and after he recovered from laughing with Chopper following quickly. 3 seconds later, Luffy burst out with his arms in the air. "Rhea's all right. Yahoo!" he shouted joyfully. He linked arms with the Chopper and Usopp, who were emerging from the doors. They began to dance and sing. "Rhea's all right. Rhea's all right. Rhea's all right," they chanted. Rhea walked out and saw them dancing. She blinked and then started to turn around when Luffy grabbed her arm and pulled her into the dance. "Hey!" she squeaked. They danced even more vigorously. Then they swung around, and Rhea lost her balance. "Whoa!" Luffy yelped, and they all fell over the rail to the deck. They landed with a whumph and lay sprawled on the deck. Chopper stood up slowly amid the groaning Usopp, Luffy, and Rhea. "Luffy, Rhea just woke up, be careful," he scolded. Nami smirked, and Zoro grinned. Luffy sat up giggling and shrugged. "That was fun. Let's do it again. Rhea's all our dash." Chopper whacked Luffy on the head and Luffy fell to the ground. Usopp laughed and Rhea smiled in relief. She stood up shakily, rubbing her bottom. Sanji stepped out of the lounge and suddenly jumped when he caught sight of Rhea. "She's awake?" he said in surprise, and then ran back in. He ran out. "Lunch is ready," he announced grandly. Nami walked up the stairs and Zoro put down his weights. He went to retrieve his katanas. Chopper and Usopp rushed inside. Luffy raced past Rhea, and then backtracked. "Oh, Rhea!" Luffy called out to Rhea. She turned around, her lean body framed by dark hair. "Yeah? Do you want to join my crew?" Rhea sucked in her breath. She was gone from Chinchama, there was no going back now. And she definitely would be a loner by herself, but these people, these pirates, they accepted her. They didn't suspect her to pickpocket them, or disappear into thin air when they needed her. She had nowhere else to go. She looked back at Luffy. Sure. Luffy had already raced into the lounge with his arms in the air before she had even finished. She smiled and a tear glinted as it fell to the deck. A hand caught it. Zoro walked up the stairs. He stopped and looked down at the drop in his hand, and then paused next to Rhea. He patted her back slowly, and then stuck his hands in his pockets. He sighed. "You're in for a hell of a ride," he said, starting to grin as he heard a crash in the lounge accompanied with yells. Another tear fell, which was caught again. He smiled to her supportively. Hey, stop crying. I can't catch your tears all the time, can I? Rhea turned to look at him. He suddenly blanked as he realized what he had just said, then started to blush slightly. He coughed, climbed the rest of the way, and opened the door. Rhea turned to look at the sea, pondering her decision. She grinned. Finally a place where I belong, she whispered quietly. The knowledge suddenly gave her a feeling she didn't recognize. She finally heard the door close, and went up the steps, took a deep breath, and went inside. Luffy stood up. "Ariae!" he shouted, and everyone started smiling, laughing, shouting, or doing all. Even Usopp managed to, whose nose was in Zoro's hand. "You'll love it here," Nami said to Rhea as the crew surrounded Rhea. Rhea started to flush with embarrassment. "Two beautiful girls on the ship. I'm so lucky," Sanji said in a shocked voice. Chopper raised his two hooves. "Hey everyone, stop crowding her. She's still a little weak," Chopper warned them. They sat down, and Rhea sat next to Nami, across from Zoro. "So, what can you do exactly?" Usopp asked Rhea as he massaged his nose. I can disappear," Nami cut in. "Fall at Luffy with a mouthful of meat." Other crew members started naming more. "Get stabbed and survive. Play tricks. Move things without moving. Float. Talk in a funny voice. Steal. Play pipes," Zoro ended with a wicked grin. "Steal?" Rhea asked in a baffled tone. Nami narrowed her eyes. "Of course. I'm gonna teach you," she said menacingly. Zoro groaned and held his head in his hands. Suddenly, all their heads turned to a small sound. They found Luffy muttering the list as he stuffed his mouth. Play poips, chomp, dish appear, munch, talk funny. He suddenly swallowed and stood up. "I've got a musical ghost," Luffy crowed proudly. "Wahoo!" he whooped. Usopp's jaw dropped. He turned to Rhea. "Why, you're a G-ghost?" he asked shakily. Rhea raised her hands above her head and a small pop was heard. She only transformed halfway, and an invisible wind moved through the room. Her hair floated up and fanned from her face, which was translucent, along with the rest of her body. Everyone gasped involuntarily. "I am the ghost of the Gleaming Mary," she said in an echoing and ethereal voice. It was meant to be a joke, but the looks on the crew's faces told otherwise. Sanji gazed at her frame raptly, and Nami grabbed the table. Chopper's eyes were opened wide. Zoro had instinctively grabbed his katanas, and then let them go. Usopp hid behind Zoro instantly. "Oh God!" The room started to look a bit less cozy. Rhea winked at them all and went whiff. Her hair fell and she ran a hand through it. "Wow!" Luffy shouted. "Going Mary's ghost is so frightening." The tension shattered and Nami whacked Luffy on the head. "That's Rhea, you dummy, not a ghost," she rebuked. Chopper wiped his brow. "Phew!" he exclaimed in relief. "I thought we had a real ghost." The others stared at Chopper. Sanji sighed. "The ghost was so beautiful." "Heh, I thought you were one for a split second," Zoro admitted. Rhea smiled sheepishly at the crew. She clasped her hands. "Sorry, I didn't mean to spook you guys out so much," she said worriedly. "Ha ha ha! Spooked!" Luffy laughed loudly. Nami and the others turned to stare at him. "Wow, actually got that," Nami murmured. Luffy put his arm around Rhea's shoulder. "Let's drink to Rhea." Everyone raised their mugs and downed their drink. Rhea smiled, and Luffy started to laugh loudly. Everyone grinned and went outside to lounge for a bit. Luffy, Usopp, Chopper, and Sanji danced around and drank some more, all to Rhea, of course. The person they cheered for leaned back on the rail and sighed with gladness. Nami walked over next to her and also watched the others' antics. Zoro seemed to notice Rhea's position on the rail and looked away, scowling. "So you're going to teach me how to steal?" Rhea asked Nami coolly. Nami nodded and her eyes shone. Rhea continued. "No offense, but I think I should learn how to defend myself. Without using my powers, maybe something offensive as well, you know?" Rhea turned to look at Nami, who was already walking halfway across the deck to the storage deck. Rhea rushed after her, and they entered the storage deck and down the stairs. Thanks for watching this video. If you really enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification. Don't forget to support and follow the Tuna role for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story, link in the description. See you in the next video. Goodbye.